Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar organized by the Institute of Development Studies, IDS, to launch the newest issue of the IDS Bulletin called Democracy Contested. My name is Marjoke Oosterom and I'm a research fellow at IDS, where I lead the Power and Popular Politics Research Cluster. And also on behalf of my colleague, Shandana Khan Mohmand, who edited this bulletin with me, a warm welcome to everyone and thanks for making time to be with us. But this week, Monday, was International Democracy Day, and not only are democracies threatened from within, also the legitimacy of international institutions and organizations have really been eroded. And the bulletin pays considerable attention to this interaction between parties and their leaders and the voters. And we also aim to plant seeds of hope as resistance to autocratization is visible. As IDS, as the name suggests, an institute dedicated to development studies, but with Batuhan, we really also wanted to highlight the processes of autocratization and backsliding are a truly global phenomena. And therefore we invited contributions from some of the world's largest democracies that experience backlash, like Brazil, Philippines, and India. And we also invited scholars examining developments in the US and Europe. And besides launching the IDS Bulletin today, IDS will pay considerable attention to the topic of democracy over the coming months, featuring outputs and think pieces from ongoing projects. And in most cases, this research is conducted with research partners and civil society actors that are centrally involved in countering democratic backlash. Today, we're joined by several of the authors who contributed to the bulletin, and they will be highlighting some of their key messages. After about 40 minutes, we'll start the discussion, and you're all very welcome to join a debate. So please drop your comments and questions in the Q&A or the chat function, and then I will convey them to the panel. I'll now introduce the panelists, and then we can move swiftly on to the first speaker, who will be Shandana Khan Mohmand, my colleague and research fellow at IDS, who leads the governance cluster here. We'll then move on to Yamini Aiyar, who is a senior visiting fellow at Brown University in the US. Then we'll hear from Oluwole Ojewale, who's a researcher at the Institute for Security Studies in Senegal. Then we'll hear from Batuhan Eren, who's a research fellow at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, Italy. And finally, we'll have John Leonard, who's an assistant professor of practice at Ohio State University. So let's begin. I hand over to Shandana.
Thank you so much, Marjoke, and thank you everyone for being here. It's been, this is a question that we've been thinking about very deeply, and it has been absolutely incredible to have the opportunity to be able to think about it together with some of leading democracy scholars from around the world. So I'm just going to share a few quick points on this. Let me start with this. But the question before us today is, why are governments becoming more autocratic? And this is a question that we've thought about through this bulletin with everybody that's joined us and so many others. And we hope you will take the time to read their articles. But I thought I would just draw out 4 very quick points from across these articles and then leave it to other speakers to be able to get into it in more detail. But before I do that, I thought I'd take a moment to say what it is that we're really concerned with here. And so this graph is really just one that shows all of the countries of the world that have been regressing, that have had a democratic backslide since the 2008 financial crisis, when we've been sort of tracking this. And this is from an article that I'm working on with my co-author Miguel Loureiro at IDS right now. And we're looking at patterns that have been sketched by backsliding countries. And there's about 57 of them. And all I want you to take away from that right now is the idea that it happens across the world. It's happening across the world. The dots represent different regions, and it shows that this is a phenomena that's everywhere. And it's also across all regime types. So if you see this country sorry about that. If you see up here, the yellow dot in this corner up here is the US, sitting all the way in what we might consider a liberalized democratic space. And this country over here, excuse me, is just between Zoom and, okay, this is now stuck. Let me try that again. This country up here, so that's the US, and this other country over here is India. And so they sit in very different regime spaces, but across them, I think my colleagues, Yamini, Aiyar, and Leonard are going to tell you that the dynamics may not be very different from what we see in these two countries, even if they're in very different regime spaces. And this is a little bit more detail of what those regime spaces look like. So you'll see that the US, that has occupied so much of our attention right now, continues to regress in what is still a liberalized democratic space, whereas India has had a much more dramatic backslide in the last few years and occupied very different regime spaces, which is the colored blocks that you see over here, moving all the way from the green liberalized democracy space to this sort of orangish liberalized autocracy, electoral autocracy space. So just moving on, so it's based on this, I think, what then is it that we're really asking about? And my job within this bulletin was to think about citizen action as voters. What is it that we're seeing through voting action? So a lot of these governments that we're trying to explain becoming more autocratic are elected. It's what Tom Carruthers in his article thinks of as leaders being elected, but anti-democratic. And so why is it that they receive the votes that they do? So we're very concerned about voting action. And as far as that is concerned, we have usually explained it by saying we're very polarized right now, and also social media. It changes the way we engage. But citizens being politically divided is not a new thing, and governments putting out a whole lot of propaganda is not a new thing either. But something is different. Something is different in this moment. And I'm just going to make 4 very quick points and then leave it to our co-authors to pick up from there. One of the first explanations that we have there is what has happened to the democratic left. And there's 2 very different perspectives on this. But what has happened to the left is a big part of our explanations right now. A perspective from the right that I took off Twitter with somebody pushing back against a new left party being formed in the UK right now is this perspective, in which the person has centered themselves right in the center and shown that in 2008 they might have felt closer to the left, and they haven't moved over time. Neither has the right in this diagram moved over time, but they see the left as having gone far, far, far to the left. And the word that they're using there, and if this were clearer, you'd be able to see that, is the word woke progressive. And this uniting frame is something that our colleague Batuhan is going to pick up on in his presentation, in his work with Manuela Kayani, and it's an article that you really must read in the bulletin. And of course, as of the events of the last week, also thinking of the far left now as also being violent. And so this is the perspective of what's really happened to the left, is this moving out all the way to the far right and progressive values that are really a politics of identity. But there's also a different perspective from the left, which is what's happened to the left is that it isn't left enough. Or a quote that really stayed with me after the last local government election in the UK was the idea that a lot of people voted for reform because Labour is simply not Labour enough. So this idea of a pro-market, conservative on welfare convergence of the left with the right actually taking on some genuinely redistributive ideas, is something that our colleague Leonard is going to pick up on. And it's in his article on the US, is what's really happened to the Democratic Party in the US during this time. And so what happens? Why do we care about what's happening with the left? And the idea there really is that there's this convergence essentially means identity politics, that parties will have to turn to some kind of a differentiating heuristic if it's no longer economics or redistribution. And that really is identity politics. It's ethnicity in global South, it's minorities, both sexual and immigrant, in the global North, it's religion increasingly everywhere. And we know, and we now hear from Thomas Carruthers' article in the bulletin, that it may also be explaining our attitudes towards aid and what's happened with aid, because we would all just be happier in a world, it seems, where everybody looks and speaks like us, that's the sort of identity politics that we're seeing emerge. The third point, and I'm going to stop very soon after this, is that we have really changed the way we exchange information. This is in the article by Mick Moore. I won't read through all of that, but it's to say that we're now living in an era of spin doctors and informational autocracy, where we might find it very hard to distinguish between democracies and autocracies, or to be able to truly hold our leaders to account, and that digitalization increases the pressure to vote expressively rather than instrumentally. And finally, the fact that we may already be deciding against democracy without experiencing what is a full democracy, that many of the backsliding parts of the world are what are electoral democracies or electoral autocracies rather than full democracies, and that mid-level democracies could be dangerous spaces because they don't deliver to citizens as they might expect. And this is in an article from Rob Jenkins and Anne-Marie Gertz, which I hope you'll also read. And of course, the big question, is liberal democracy really set up to deliver in the ways that we would like, or do we really need to rethink what is democracy? I'll stop there.
Thank you. I believe I'm next. My contribution to the bulletin looks at the context of India, which just went through its general election in 2024 May. The election itself was particularly interesting because it came against a backdrop of a nearly decade-long semi-authoritarian shadow. In many different ways, the BJP that had acquired single-party dominance from 2014 onwards and continued to expand its dominance in the 2019 election had spent the 5 years in the run-up to the national election in 2024 really using all the coercive powers available to it to close down spaces of both political opposition, partisan opposition, as well as broader dissent in society. Media was compromised on the eve of the elections. Two subnational chief ministers who were seen as major opposition opposition leaders were jailed on corruption charges. Several others were in jail and kept there without bail. The courts were looking increasingly compromised. And essentially, there was a very dark shadow of authoritarianism that lurked very visibly. And the BJP goes into the election on the back of two important slogans. One was that this time they will cross 400, as in a lower house of 540 seats, that they would actually hit close to complete dominance by getting 400. You need 275 to get a majority. And also in January, the consecration of a temple in Ayodhya that had been the seat of the ideological battle that is at the heart of the rise of BJP's dominance in Indian politics around the question of whether India was a secular nation with multiple religions and multiple identities, ethnicities, languages cohering together within the framework of the nation state, where that multiplicity was given equal significance in the structure of the nation state, or was it a Hindu majoritarian nation in which the Hindu identity gets cohered with our political identity and all other religious identities, most notably the Muslim, would be treated as second citizenship. Ayodhya was a site where a temple that was seen to be holy and critical and at the center of precisely this debate, the Ayodhya temple where Lord Ram was considered to have been born, upon which there was a mosque, was the site of the growing mobilization around this idea of Hindu majoritarianism. In the early 1990s, the mosque was torn down by a mobilized political mob. And in January 2024, kind of as a completion of the ideological project, in some senses, a temple was constructed on this site where the mosque was torn with Supreme Court compliance. The Supreme Court had enabled allowed this to happen. And the Prime Minister breaking the principal distance between state and religion, which is at the heart of Indian secularism, is sort of present at this consecration almost as the key player, the key participant of what was a religious ceremony. So it also seemed as though the dominance, the ideological dominance too had been achieved. And this was a context in which India went into elections. Halfway through what was a long 2-month campaign, it started becoming amply clear to anyone that stepped out of their homes and was talking with people that in fact this dominance was slipping away. And indeed, when the results came, the BJP still came back with a majority, but it won only 240 and not 400 seats. And a very important surprise, the state of Uttar Pradesh, where Ayodhya, the city of Ayodhya and this temple, which is the heart of the ideological struggle was, the BJP actually lost significant ground on the back of caste identities playing an important role in the elections. So the BJP comes back in a coalition government, not a dominant government. And it raises this question of how does the voter behave in the context of deep democratic erosion, which was the context in which India goes into the election. I draw on a survey that I conducted with other colleagues called the India Election Survey, where I may present the argument that voters actually responded to this deep authoritarian overreach in ways that projected the presence of a democratic sentiment in Indian society on questions related to critical aspects such as the dominance of Prime Minister Modi in the media. Could the BJP actually change the constitution and make it a less secular constitution? Is India a secular country? We got an overwhelming response that essentially argued that there was too much dominance of Modi in the media. Yes, the BJP could potentially change the constitution, and that was a challenge, particularly amongst lower castes, because they saw that as a means to take away reservations, which are constitutional guarantees. That India indeed is a secular country. And what is particularly important is that you see a correlation between the expression of the democratic sentiment and a broad sense of frustration with the economy. So as you go to layers of society that are more affected by weakening economic realities, you can see them express this sense of frustration with the more authoritarian tendencies of the BJP, and there is a direct correlation with voting with reduced majority of the BJP. However, this presence of a democratic sentiment, crucial as it is, also comes with its own contradictions. And I argue, using David and Halliday's framework of limited liberalism, to point out that as we think about the complex dynamics of how voters behave in the context of democratic erosion, we need to understand that there are contradictory pulls and pressures in how voters respond to authoritarian tendencies. In our survey, and indeed in field work, we noticed that while voters were very articulate in talking about constitutional rights in the context of caste inequalities, there in fact was a silence and almost an acquiescence on the question of the failure of the constitution to protect the Muslim minority. And you could see this both in how voters responded to some of the contradictory questions. 79.5% voters argued that India was indeed a secular country, but an equally large number supported the claim that Hindus have been victimized partly by the Muslims in India. So these complex pulls and pressures play out in the context of ideological identity-based battles, and the real challenge of reaffirming and rebuilding democratic sentiment is being able to be sensitive to these complex realities, understand the nature of limited liberalism, and for political opposition and mobilization to try and identify these sites of limited liberalism to see where alternative political mobilization can take place to challenge the dominance of authoritarian democratically elected governments. So my paper really is an attempt to try and understand the nuances of voter behavior and identify sites of democratic resilience in this broader backdrop of democratic erosion that India certainly confronts. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Oluwole, you're next.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marjoke. I think our home paper focused on 3 countries with a common thread about youth participation in fostering democratic resilience in Sudan, Senegal, and in Nigeria, looking at events that crystallized between 2019 and 2023, starting from the case of Sudan, in which youth protests tried to roll back authoritarian tendencies and foster a new culture of democratic resistance in the country. And then the case of Nigeria, which has to do with the EndSARS protests in 2021, and how the state actually responded to that crisis through the instrument of framing the whole experience as a national security threat, in which some protesters were arrested and charged with terrorism crime. And then the case of Senegal, in which a president that has performed exceptionally well based on the Senegalese rating in terms of infrastructure development, improvement in the quality of life of the people, then started making attempts to form what has been considered in West Africa as a constitutional coup, and by elongating his stay in power. And when that attempt failed, then he started undermining the electoral process through different means. So these three countries have similar peculiar characteristics in terms of spontaneous development that warrant people to foster democratic resistance. But I think why the Sudan outcome, the jury is yet to be out. We can see how that protest has led to spiral into unsavory development, to the point that the military have to take over the reign of government in the country, to the EndSARS movement that promised so much but deliver so little, and to the Senegal, which I think is the best outcome out of the three. So we look at the imaginary of people in terms of how they frame democratic resistance across these three countries. And the case of Senegal, which I think provides an example in which, at least within West African sub-region, in which we are seeing democratic erosion in the recent time, offers an example, offers a seed of hope that can be borrowed, that can be studied for other countries that are going through similar challenges in the region. We zero on the role of the youth and how they leverage social media and the diaspora connection to actually roll back democratic erosion in the country, and then foster a serious and respected resistance to the authoritarian drift in Senegal. So the case of Sudan, Nigeria, and Senegal, we see that there was a methodology that was employed by the youth in which they left the traditional protest, democratic resistance that was led historically by the labor union, by activists, in the hand of the generation that they now consider to be Gen Z, who are looking towards their European counterpart, American counterpart, and they believe that the quality of life is being improved in those places. I'm going to come back to that later in terms of imaginary. And they feel they also need to get involved in their democratic participation in their country. But the only window of opportunity that was provided for them was to register their displeasure against the state, particularly like in the case of Nigeria, which the EndSARS focus on bad behavior of a rogue police unit in the country, and they use that as a metaphor for bad governance in the country. The same in Sudan, in which the same experience is about youth participation and the need to roll back not just autocracy, not just authoritarianism, but to roll back bad governance, and they feel they have a better idea to foster inclusive development and chart a new path for development and democratic resilience in their country. And the same thing with Senegal as well, which also has been a bastion of democracy in the region, the only country that has never had a military incursion into politics since 1960, and which has been regarded as the bastion of democracy for more than 50 years in the country. And then faced with this constitutional coup that was about to happen in the country, and which was vehemently resisted through the participation of the youth in the country. And looking at all these together in our paper, we come to a conclusion that in Africa, there is yearning for democracy, but the interpretation of democracy in the psyche of the youth in the continent differs a bit from what is obtainable maybe in their Western countries that everybody look up to, particularly in Europe and the US. So for an African youth, democracy is working when it is delivering good governance. And good governance means improvement in health outcome, improvement in educational outcome, job opportunities for all, and infrastructure development, youth participation, and all these. Whereas in other places, they are discussing other ideas about liberal democracy, how the right of the people are to be protected and all those things. For African youth, we find out that those are secondary issues, even though they are very, very important. So the interpretation of democracy on this continent for most people is that it delivers what they consider to be good governance. And to the extent to which they can't really feel that effect, they can't really experience that in their daily life, in the way that they engage and what the democratic outcomes mean to them, then they have to go back to the street. And that is the reason why we continue to see this ripple effect from Kenya's anti-tax protest in the recent time, EndSARS in Nigeria, the protest in Sudan, the protests in Senegal. There's a common thread that binds all these protests together. And it's the fact that the interpretation of what democracy means to the youth here is that it must deliver good governance for them. And it also means that what they consider to be sacred in terms of the constitutional limit, in terms of the constitutional overreach of the executive in the recent time, have to be curtailed and maintain the status quo. So people go to the streets to push back for such autocratic tendencies that we've seen across board. And going back to what I'm going to anchor on is the fact that these three countries present similar experience, but three different outcomes. And we argue here that the Senegal outcome is the outcome that I think other countries that are facing democratic recession on the continent have to really borrow and study and see how they can transplant those ideas into their country. And it anchors on one thing, which is the rediscovering of the role of the civil society, which is not the regular NGO system. The civil society comprising of labor unions, the youth, even the diaspora youths, and leveraging the technology that is available at their disposal to mobilize for two things. One, to stem the tide of authoritarianism in the region, and at the same time to force their leaders to become accountable. And I think the Senegal actually tick these boxes as we argued in our paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Olu. Moving on to Batuhan.
Okay, well, first I would like to thank again IDS for inviting me to this very timely event. I'm from Turkey, by the way, and we are facing serious challenges to democracy these days, such as the arrest of elected politicians like Istanbul's Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu and the repression of peaceful protests. So it's very striking to listen all these struggles from the different parts of the world. And our article is precisely about this issue, actually. How and why do we observe similar challenges to democracy and liberalism in different contexts? And more importantly, we ask the question of how these challenges are connected to each other, how they feed each other, how they contribute to each other. Because as we have seen in the current political context in the last 20 years, there is this growing pattern of transnationalization of far-right and illiberal politics, which are the main challengers to democratic regimes and liberal democracy today. So if you would like to understand the rise of far-right actors or illiberal actors and how they come to power in different contexts, then I think we need to understand their connection to each other. And these connections are not only limited to the political parties, but also it includes social movements, civil society organizations, think tanks, and activist groups. So you can see the formation of various groups like the Patriots for Europe in the European Parliament, but also you can also see street demonstrations organized by groups like Generation Identity. So these actors increasingly feel the need to establish a transnational contact and cooperation to expand their impact reputation and legitimacy. They co-organize events and activities together, exchange ideas, discuss them, and learn from each other. So based on our previous and the current research of our research team under the Outlook project, we investigate this phenomenon of the transnationalization of far-right and illiberal politics in our article. And in our framework, we believe that this transnationalization process has three major elements. First, formation of organizational networks among these illiberal actors. The second one is the construction of common and shared frames by these actors. And the last one is the organization of transnational events and meetings organized by these actors. And we can clearly see these elements in various transnational far-right movements, such as the anti-gender one, as we discussed in the article. So in terms of organizational networking, anti-abortion and pro-family groups, think tanks, associations such as, for example, Pro Vita e Famiglia in Italy, or 40 Days for Life as an international organization, and different Catholic organizations and activist groups. The nationalist far-right actors in various countries creates a very well network hub to oppose policies promoting gender equality. So these well-networked actors also invest significantly in the transnational mobilization events and meetings. They organize and participate in various transnational events, such as the 2019 World Congress of Families in Verona, Italy, in which different anti-gender NGOs were present, and the Italian Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini was a spokesperson. So these events bring different actors together, not only parties, but also non-parties. It's important to mention that all these actors have very different roles to play. Political parties bring the resources and legitimacy to the table, while think tanks and cultural organizations function as the brokers that initiate these events and disseminate these ideas. Regarding these shared ideas and frames, these events serve as platforms for mutual learning, but also construction of the common frames to be used in the national context, such as the famous gender ideology to pejoratively criticize any progressive policies promoting gender equality. Once constructed, these frames diffuse across different countries, and this is an important mechanism for this transnationalization mechanism. These frames, ideas, or strategies are adopted by different type of actors and recontextualized according to the needs and objectives of these actors. Think about the example of wokeness and anti-wokeness, as Shandana also mentioned. It is a concept, anti-wokeness emerged in the US context to criticize any type of progressive ideas against the social and racial injustices by labeling them as woke. Such framing is also adopted by the European and the UK-based far-right groups, but this time they also added a nativist and nationalist emphasis to anti-wokeness. Wokeness is framed as an alien, US-important, and anti-European ideology that is aligned with Islamoleftism, and aims to destroy European civilization and local cultures. Especially, for example, in the case of France, which we are working on these days, we can see how wokeness is strongly framed as a dangerous and foreign threat to French values, French society, and Republican ideas. As can be seen in this example, the transnationalization provides actors with ideas to connect them to a transnational community, but also give them tools to use in their own national context to expand their influence in a coordinated way. Of course, this is not a one-sided process. Transnationalization of far-right is a growing phenomenon, but also there's other side of the coin in which we see many counter-movements against these populist and far-right views. In the article, we present one of these movements, which is the Italian Sardine movement that emerged at the end of 2019 to defend Bologna against the potential victory of Matteo Salvini's Lega party in the regional elections. Despite its short life due to COVID and organizational problems, the movement became successful to contribute what it aims to. It spread across Italy as an anti-populist movement model, and it even inspired other movements in total different contexts, like the Selekkalike movement in Finland. Both Sardine and Selekkalike used very understandable and simple messages instead of complex ideological manifestations. They acknowledged the feelings and emotions of their audience in their discourses. They use culturally resonant practices and symbols such as sardine fish in Italy and herring fish in Finland. They enable people to use their creativity in their activities. They ask common people without much political experience to join protest, and they use very inclusive language based on citizenship, and common people, while also targeting some specific actors in their discourses, such as Salvini's Lega in Italian context. So we believe that stories such as Sardine and Selekkalike can give us some inspiration and information about how to form a transnational resistance front to this rising far-right threat to liberal democracy. Because if you would like to stop an increasing the transnational political force, then it is also necessary to formulate a similar transnational front that brings different actors together despite their ideological differences, create new frames that culturally resonate with people, and organize joint events to reach a broader audiences that is beyond national audiences. So at the moment, we are not sure, of course, how to do that, but we are trying to find some ways. And we would like to discuss this issue more in the discussion with the participant and the audience to find some answers, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you, Batuhan. And before I hand over to Don Leonard, I just wanted to point out that we also have like an article dedicated to gender in the bulletin. Batuhan already mentioned gender dynamics in the overall mobilization of the far right in Europe and transnationally, but we also have specifically an article by Moira Kubigmano and Professor Cecilia Saudenbach speaking to Brazil and the intersection of class, race, and gender in Brazil, and the rise of political violence against women and sexual minorities in politics under Bolsonaro's administration. So I just wanted to also point that out because they're not here today. So now I hope Don Leonard has been able to catch your breath, and please speak. You can open your mic and speak to your article. So, hi, Don.
Hi, thank you so very much. And I want to apologize to everyone for my incredibly informal appearance here. Think of this as like live on CNN from the front lines of America's dying democracy. I'm just returning from a massive protest here in Ohio, one of the United States' central battleground states and for control of the U.S. Congress and the House of Representatives. And right now, the Republican state legislature is trying to redistrict a map that profoundly disadvantages the Democratic Party in exchange for the Republican Party. However you feel about partisan politics, it's very apparent that the state legislature here, on orders from on high from Washington, D.C., and President Trump himself, are not at all interested in a fair and democratic contest. And that sort of provides, I think, a framing for my article, which is also a personal experience for me about what it was like to be an outsider from the United States looking in on processes of populism and democratic rollback in Latin America as a doctoral student and then as a scholar of international development here at The Ohio State University, but always, I think, quite from a, quite Western, if I'm really forced to be honest with myself, vantage point of assuming that the democratic institutions of the United States, while deeply flawed, were surely incapable of the kinds of democratic decay that I was seeing across my regional expertise of Latin America. I would say the joke's on me, but I'm afraid it's far worse than a joke. My article in broad strokes makes 5 central claims about democracy and democratic backsliding that I think the rest of the world can learn from the Americas. And when I say the Americas, now more than ever, I am being inclusive of the United States as a deeper and more empathetic partner to the Americas in terms of our quest to deepen democracy. So my first point is probably an obvious one to everyone on this call, which is that the world's oldest constitutional democracy is backsliding. And what I spend time doing is looking at Trump's first 100 days in office of this term, which is around the time that I had to hit stop on this article before the editors murdered me. And in this time already, within the first 100 days, I would say the Trump administration's actions almost rivaled those of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who really sort of pioneered the phenomenon of a 100-day sprint out of an election. Unfortunately, the policies and practices that President Trump pursued had nothing to do with rescuing the United States from economic decay or strengthening our labor and democratic institutions. He threatened to jail opponents, which was a sort of a carryover from the previous administration in 2016 to 2020. But he also started jailing legal residents of the United States, and not in any normal jails, but picking them up off the streets and sweeping them away. I'm sure many of you on this call have seen examples of this in the international news. Perhaps you've contemplated coming to the United States and opted not to for fear of what kind of resistance you might encounter at the border checkpoints. What I can tell you as someone living through this with colleagues from all over the world is it's as real and serious and terrifying as the news reports would have us believe. I'm smiling. My daughter's in the back here, so I may have to speed up. Fighting for democracy is hard. So my first lesson is going to be populism is always and everywhere anti-democratic. And I use the example of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela as a sort of a proof of this, because I don't think there ever was a candidate that was more democratically elected than Chavez in '98. Hang on, let me grab a little squishy toy. Hey, tweeters. Again, I really apologize for the informality, everyone. Had it not been a democracy protest, I would be safe at home in my study. But the little whale seemed to have worked. So Chavez gets elected in 1998, profoundly free and fair election, immediately goes to move against the Supreme Court of Venezuela, threatening to either shut them down or court pack them unless they agree to a constitutional referendum, or rather a constitutional assembly that has no precedent in the Venezuelan constitution, which then allows him to carve out the power structure that would govern Venezuela up until today, essentially. While voter registration in Venezuela increased dramatically during the early Chavez years, I noted as I was reminding myself for this article that it did not happen in a linear, steady way that would suggest that Chavez's commitment to deeper democratization was the function of some ideological commitment. Rather, when the 2003 elections for the constitutional referendum were pending, there was sort of a sprint by his movement. And politicians going to politic, but a very deliberate effort to enfranchise poor Venezuelan voters precisely at that moment for the purpose of tipping the election in his favor. So again, I think if you have time to look at the article, you'll see that there's a pretty compelling case that even in a situation where a democratically elected, nominally populist, nominally pro-democratic candidate is elected, they may not in fact be able to strengthen democracy. And the reason for that is intrinsic to the concept of populism itself. Practically by definition, populism is designed to erode the institutional safeguards that constrain the exercise of and concentration of executive authority. And those institutional safeguards are part of what makes democracy democracy. So any politician, left or right, regardless of ideological commitments, who threatens to weaken those institutional safeguards and establish a direct, unmediated relationship with the constituents, with the base, that unmediated relationship is profoundly undemocratic. The third lesson is sort of focusing on one of the previous facets I mentioned, which was Chavez was democratically elected. So was Evo Morales in Bolivia in 2005 when I was serving there as a Peace Corps volunteer, a U.S. government program to send Americans abroad for a couple of years and try to get us to learn at least one foreign language. During the course of Evo Morales' rule, as has been featured prominently in recent news, we see a different and I think fundamentally more pragmatic approach to leftist populist politics than what we saw in Venezuela, but nonetheless a steady erosion of the kinds of checks and balances and separations of power that democracy depends upon. Quickly moving to part 4 here. Hard times increase the electoral viability of populist candidates. This is where we can see the beginnings of a distributional politics of democracy and potentially democratic decay. Essentially, what we have here in the United States, bringing us to the present moment in time, is a situation where the living wage for a single individual, that's calculated by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Living Wage Institute. If you're interested in a precedent for how one would go about measuring such a thing, that is the place to begin. According to the MIT Living Wage Institute, the living wage for a single person in the United States today is somewhere around $42,000 a year in a community of average expense like Columbus, Ohio, where I currently am. Of course, if you're in New York or San Francisco, completely different story, and they have numbers for those places too. But what we see is Columbus is pretty close to the country's median for personal income, and that number actually is the exact same number as median personal income in the United States, so in the living wage line. What I'm trying to tell you here is that the average, or the median American currently earns right at the living wage line. Now, put on your math hats for a second here. That means that half of all Americans, if the median income American is at the living wage line, half of all Americans are below it. And this is not an extravagant living wage line. It provides no provisions for chronic health conditions, for student loan payments, saving for retirement. This is simply just enough to allow you to consume a normal basket of goods without accruing consumer debt month by month. So hard times are upon the United States, and statistically speaking, I think there's a really important convergence here in just how many and when, according to voter theory and public choice theory, when we would expect the median income voter to abandon institutionalized parties and established candidates in favor of populist outsiders who offer some alternative, presumably under the assumption that the prevailing institutional parties have lost all economic legitimacy. Part 5 goes into that in more detail, and it describes how the Democratic Party...
Done
Yep.
very quickly, though, because we're moving on to discussion soon. So your point 5 in a few lines, and then we'll need to move
point
back
5
to
in a few
panel.
lines. Great, thank you for the help with timekeeping. So point 5 here is that simply when these things converge and with their base because of the neoliberal consensus that has dominated much of the planet, I would say, since Reagan and Thatcher brought it to fruition in 1980. We essentially have a situation where voters abandoned traditional parties, seeking the very populist outsiders that trigger democratic backsliding. Thank you.
John, thank you so much, and especially joining from the situation where in the back of the car and studying youth political socialization. Myself, I can say your role modeling take to your child how to claim civic and political rights. So well done for that. We're now open for debate. Please leave any questions or comments to the panel in the Q&A box, and I will start moderating and pinpointing them towards the different speakers. Of course, the theme of inequalities and living wages that Don is speaking to comes up in several of the contributions in the bulletin on how day-to-day realities are informing people's voter choices. What also comes up, thankfully, are seeds of hope around people still wanting democracy and also want a better version of it and how it would work for them. And people express this in different ways, not just through voting, but also on the streets, as Oluwole spoke to. And what struck me from also Yamini's article is how that's not just in overt protest, it's how neighbors speak to each other. and how democratic sentiments also spread horizontally in very everyday ways. So we should not just be looking for the big protests on the streets, but how does it happen in everyday social situations? And we know that resistance is more likely to be effective when different resistance actors interact, collaborate, and use multiple strategies. So how is that everyday resistance, could it connect to more organized resistance? And the Senegalese youth that Oluwole spoke about also had their allies in the courts, for example, two very important actors working together. So we have already received one question from Alvaro Contreras on the thoughts on the relationship between the decline of democracy and the decline of social capital. Shandana and Batuhan are going to speak to this. Shandana.
Marjoke, I might also take a second question together with the one on social capital from Alvaro Contreras, and then there is another question from Abigail Kearns to all of us, and others please pick up on that. But Alvaro has a question on social capital and the extent to which that has to do with these trends that we're looking at. And my own sense on that is a lot has been written about social capital, of course, but things like civil society organizing or social capital in particular don't always have a sort of particular set of values or norms attached to it. And we've seen that in recent past where it's not a lack of organizing, it's just citizens organizing at very different polarized ends of a spectrum from each other. And we find our spaces within that. So people may have very rich connections and relationships with one another, but it doesn't help explain why we're seeing more and more autocratization or selecting autocratic leaders. And a really interesting piece to read on this that I quote to my students very often is that Robert Putnam, who wrote about this, his own student used his principles to show how the richest period possibly in terms of social capital in Germany was in the interwar years when we saw the rise of the Nazi Party. And it wasn't for a lack of social capital, but it was social capital of a very particular nature that connected people on values that saw specific kinds of identity being prioritized over others. So if we go with that definition, then we are seeing a lot of organizing just against certain minority identities or certain identities, different identities around the world. And that's something I was hoping Batuhan would pick up on, because that's really what their article is about as well, is the organizing on the far right. And just very quickly to Abigail's question about the role of civil society and what kinds of messages, I would say to focus to a great extent on what Don just spoke about as well, or what is in the article on Brazil, is the extent to which we need to be inclusive, but in being inclusive, we've got to maintain a real focus on redistribution. And that's essentially where the left seems to have been losing out in going in sort of prioritizing the politics of recognition over what is the politics of genuine redistribution and genuine economic transformation, because the world isn't necessarily poorer now than it was a few decades ago. In fact, the stats give a different story, but it is more unequal. And it's and that's really the space in which we need to think about what has our economics brought us to and what has our liberal democracy brought us to, and in what ways can we think in terms of greater redistribution. And maybe that's more of the language of that sort of economic transformation and redistribution and inclusion through that might be the language that's needed by civil society now.
Okay, it was a perfect answer, Shandana. Thank you for this introduction. And it's a great question, by the way, that I also ask myself a lot while working on the far right. So thank you, Alvaro, for this question. And it's very interesting because there are various discussions if the social isolation leads to the participation in far right groups, but research like ours also demonstrate that, networking and connection to other groups is a very fundamental driving force for the far right actors. They invest a lot in this building of networked communities, not also nationally, but also transnationally as well, as we discussed in the article. So it's a network political trend, which also invests significantly on intellectual work. The think tanks and the cultural organizations are the fundamental actors of the rise of far right. Like the Center for the Fundamental Rights in Hungary, it's the most transnational actor ever that bring actors together, that create new ideas, that spread it, and that form a kind of resistance against the liberal academia and liberal intellectuals by providing some alternatives to other actors, other groups. So such groups, actually, such significant actors play a very central role in this formation of networks and also the intellectual outputs and outcomes, that become more and more influential, that become more and more unpopular, and that bring different groups together to increase their, visibility and legitimacy in both national and transnational politics. So I'm not so sure, actually, in this context, if we can say there is this positive correlation between decline of social democracy and decline of social capital, because again, far right in their own ways invest a lot on this social capital to increase it more in their own approaches, in their own ways. And yeah, meanwhile, they also again invest a lot on social media as well. So this is a bit connected to the second question, because I think this is the next front for the progressives and liberal forces and maybe socialist forces. I don't know how you would call, but the social media presence today is very significant. The far right is heavily invested on in this new front, and because of that, it should turn into a kind of resistant front, because that the major platforms that are used by far right actors to spread their ideas are the Instagram Reels, Instagram memes, TikTok videos, etc. So, and they resonate a lot with people, their audiences, and they reach even a broader audience that they cannot do with their limited resources. So I believe that maybe investing more on these platforms to create new and alternative narratives that really resonate with the people, the users, can be a good step to actually, start finding new followers and supporters that can turn into participants of this democratic front against this illiberal politics. So this is just an idea. Maybe we can discuss the social media dimension more in the following questions, because I think it's a very crucial one if we would like to do something to develop and improve democracy in this conflict.
Thanks very much, both. There is one comment on the role of business, and then there are two questions that I would like to connect to also the role of democracy promotion and international aid. And we're speaking about very different contexts, Europe and the US, but also we've got countries represented in the bulletin that have been recipients of democracy funding, or civil society have been recipients of funding to promote democracy. So there's also a couple of questions linked to this. But first, on the role of business, which are to Don and Batuhan again. If you could comment on the role of business in the recent political dynamics. Don first. Batuhan, could you please comment on the role of business in that case?
Yeah, maybe I can start. Well, our research doesn't cover a lot on this issue, but I think there are 2 points that should be taken into consideration based on the findings. The first one is, yes, I think it has it's a very strong negative impact, because, well, in the cases of far-right networking, what we observe is that the illiberal businessmen like Elon Musk, particularly, play a very central role in promoting these ideas, and also it functions as a kind of an actor that different actors try to get attention to get connected with him. He represents something, and this brings legitimacy, this brings reputation to the actors, I don't know about the resources dimension, but at least from this more social dimension, we can clearly see that it's emerged. These kind of actors emerge as kind of role models that are tried to be associated with by the different far right actors and groups. And it's already say something about how this current business atmosphere and current business context play a role in the rise of far right politics. And as a second point, in one of the interviews that I conducted with a pro-family and anti-LGBTQI group in Italy, the leader mentioned that actually they want to formulate a business model in which every participant can win something. It's not like sacrifices and commitment only, but if you want to, if you would like to join the cause, then you should also win something. So I'm saying this because actually this also demonstrates that how this neoliberal business model play a very central role in the formulation of many organizational formats. And it is very crucial to understand its dynamic if you really want to understand how these different groups function, especially if they have limited resources, because such model bring a kind of mindset that focus on the gains, not only the ideological satisfaction or fulfillment, but also physical and resource-based gains. So this is, I think, a crucial part of how business itself and business model play a role in this far right politics.
Yeah, thank you. And it's clear that business plays a role in also like who makes it into power, as well as once into power, can be an increased concentration of economic and business elites and through the use of the state, but also thinking of the context of Poland post the peace government that actually anti-corruption against lawsuits against corruption by the previous administration was one of the ways to dismantle that business conglomerate. Yamini, you also had a point on the role of business.
Thank you. I just wanted to sort of bring India into this conversation as well, because the role of business has played a really important role in shaping political party funding. And in fact, I think India is an interesting case to see how corporate consolidation and the creation of one, two, maybe at best three firms as sort of oligarchies support political centralization that then enables the kind of authoritarian dominance that we've been seeing. The way it's played out in India is quite interesting because crony capitalism has always been a part and parcel of India's kind of economic growth story, especially after it opened up in the early 1990s. But what was interesting about it is that it coincided with a phase of deep regionalization of Indian politics as subnational regional parties started becoming an important player in national politics. So the relationship between capital and politics kind of became quite decentralized as we saw the emergence of a large number of regional conglomerates that use their presence in regional in subnational regions of India, and the political relevance of regional parties and national government to kind of become part to compete for big national contracts. So there was a kind of regionalization, so to speak, of crony capitalism. So degrees of diversity across sectors of the economy, crony nonetheless, but it fed into party funding and kind of allowed for a multi-party competitive system to cohere. One of the big shifts that have happened with the emergence of the BJP since 2014 and at the national level as a single party dominant party is that it has used its ability, its control over the national levers of the economy to essentially eke out the regional competition and consolidate its base within actually primarily one big conglomerate who gets a large number of contracts. And these are largely contracts that are not tradable services, but big infrastructure, part and parcel of building the infrastructure, logistics, power, energy transition of the country. This is incentive compatible with political centralization, because as you've consolidated the economy into one or two big business houses, you've also then eked out regional capitalism and therefore taken away one of the primary sources of political financing for regional parties, thus being able to effectively control and play party financing. And one of the most visible features of this is the way in which money is used by the BJP, its spending in national elections, and its ability to use money to buy out voters, to buy out elected representatives, and horse trade is also very high, which leaves regional parties and smaller parties at huge disincentives. And just one last expression of this was on the eve of the elections, the National Party, the Indian National Congress, that was the primary national opposition around which all the regional parties came together into an alliance, did a press conference where they said all their bank accounts had been frozen by the income tax department. And so suddenly on the eve of the election, they couldn't access a large amount of their money necessary for fighting the election. So how these two play out is in the Indian context is just one illustration of the close relationship between capital and authoritarian power, even in democratic contexts.
One very hard-to-mental, should there be a new government afterwards. Don, please, a brief intervention on the role of business, and then we'll move over to the question of aid and civil society.
Okay, thank you. And I will have to be fast. My little one is starting to squeak. Jeffrey Winters, in a book, Oligarchy, makes a pretty profound, but I think intuitive claim. Democracy cannot exist under the condition of extreme income inequality and wealth inequality. The reason for that is the time-honored connection between wealth and power. If democracy is to be meaningful, power must be diffusely distributed within the society. And if wealth is allowed to concentrate, eventually that wealth will find ways to circumvent the vote and corrupt. This is precisely what we've seen in the United States, of course. Observers who know the Citizens United case well will know that the business community got Supreme Court justices into our high court through an outfit named Federalist Society. This all sounds very conspiratorial. It's real. And the Federalist Society vetted judges allowed a ruling that money equals speech, and thus allows corporations to engage in political speech acts with unlimited sums of money, so long as they're not coordinating directly with political campaigns. As a result, they've hacked the operating system of American democracy, and here we are today. I sign off.
Well done. Great, thank you. So there are questions on the role of civil society and the new role of civil societies, which both in European countries, as in the US, face lack of funding, shortening of funding, but also constraints on civic space. Simultaneously, there's a decrease, there are many aid cuts, there's a decrease for civil society organizations overseas that were active in democracy promotion. So one question is this perhaps an opportunity? That was basically discussed. Is this perhaps an opportunity for civil society or perhaps more grassroots movement to do work of their own? But also, how should priorities and strategies now shift, given that there are fewer resources? Is this a moment for new strategies and new models? And what should they look like? Oluwole, can I start with you on this question?
Thank you so much. Once again, I think having listened to different speakers, having this kind of conversation, one thing that is always standing out for me is the fact that democracy means different things in different contexts, and we have to bear that in mind. Why in the West it is largely about ideological contestations. Other people in places where I am in Africa are bothered about how democracy is going to deliver for them. But in the context of that, they also look towards the West as a model of a democracy that works. And two instances, January 6th experience in the United States and the 2.0 that is going on, I think is creating a serious disruption for people in the global South, particularly who have a frame definition of what they expect democracy to be. So incidents that are coming up, being reported daily, look like a everyday experience in African authoritarian regime, gerrymandering, political redistricting, all sorts of electoral violence and political violence, which if you go to Zimbabwe, Uganda, Nigeria, have been part of the democracy over the years. And in places where people think democracy come from, so to speak, and then they see these experiences resurging in those places. I think it put a serious question mark and that calls for introspection here. And I have illustrated that example for one reason. Anytime we see high-handedness of political participators or actors in Africa, you see American embassies issuing statements about political realities and experiences in African context, condemning those experiences. But, recent experience is redefining that, and it leads me in one direction, that internally, like in Africa, we really need to define what democracy means to the people, what they want democracy to deliver for them. And we can't give up on the civil society engagement. Two things which I will point in the direction as suggestion is one, I think there's a need to rediscover the role of the civil society. And I'm talking about organic civil society in Africa that spearheaded the liberation movement, for instance, the role of the labor union, the youth, the student union. These are serious leverages that help to enshrine democracy some years back, which I think a paradigm shift that led to the proliferation of portfolio-based NGOs who are looking for grants from American, USAID, DFID, Foreign Office, and all these things. I think they changed that paradigm, and we need to go back because that was a model that truly worked and actually help people and empower people to participate and have a say in democracy, like Afrobarometer will say on this continent. The second factor, which I think is also very important, and I will speak in African context, is that we need to also rediscover or bring or develop an alternative for African philanthropy. We didn't make that argument in our papers, but I think this is very, very important, particularly looking at the fact that there has always been the gravitation towards the West in supporting democracy and good governance programs in Africa. It appears that this disruption is going to be at least for the next 4 years, and we can't give up on the work that we've been doing. So how can we rally African institution, academia? How can we rally African philanthropies to actually begin to support some of these ideas that the civil society have been pushing over time? I think those are the two areas that are very, very important for me as somebody who has been observing development and initiative that have been going on in Africa in terms of supporting democracy and good governance.
Thanks, Ojewale. It's also, Thomas Carruthers has also noted like there's a lack of leadership at the moment. Just who's standing up for democracy now? Who should we be looking at? The US is not even a donor in this field any longer. European governments have their own challenges and struggles, not only in aid, but very much also about their legitimacy, about having anything meaningful to say about the quality of democracy, given the challenges they're facing. And as researchers, we've often been asked, how do we influence governments? But these governments are harder to influence. Where do we direct our efforts? Is it supporting a new and very different alliances within the African context? For example, Oluwole, you're speaking about African philanthropy, African movements. What's the role of researchers sitting elsewhere in the US and Europe connecting with these, or the role of civil society in Europe connecting with these movements? Oluwole, would you be able to speak to that as well?
Yes, thank you so much. I think this is going to be a temporary disruption. I don't think all the norms and the values that the liberal order represent are probably going to vanish in the next 4 years. I think this should just be a stopgap for us to really reflect and see how we can probably activate sleeping cells, like I mentioned in my last intervention about The resources exist. It is just where those resources are being channeled to and how they are being channeled. For instance, let me also talk in terms of African context. About $100 billion comes as remittance to Africa, I think in 2024. But those remittances are actually coming to support somebody who needs to eat, somebody who needs to meet the basic necessity. How much of that can go into givings that are going to support some of these programs and initiatives that can make life better for people at home and that can improve the quality of life of people? Some months ago, one of the former dictators in Nigeria was launching a memoir, and the richest people in the country and even the richest man in Africa, who happens to be in Nigeria, in less than 4 hours of a meeting, they raised $11 million in that meeting. And that is to support a former dictator who has just launched a book. So some of these resources are existing in Africa, but I think there is no structure around corporate giving, around individual givings to support research and engagement, to support initiative that tries to empower people to actually drive good governance on the continent. So I think these are areas that we need to focus on because to a large extent, European Union, the American, everybody is focusing on security now. And you can't tell countries not to determine what should be their priority. So development must not stall because there is a shift in that ideological bent. I think what is important is to really look inward and then activate those opportunities that have been lying fallow for us in Africa.
Thanks very much. Yamini, can you speak to the Indian context here?
Thank you. I'm going to steer a little bit away from what I wrote in my paper to speak to this issue, partly also on the back of personal experience, because it isn't easy in a context of democratic erosion to think about this question of how civil society can mobilize, because all of us, both whether we wear our researcher hats, our academic hats, or our civil society mobilization hats, are sort of on the other side dealing with the brunt of the crushing of spaces for independent thinking, critical research, mobilization that challenges governments. Authoritarian governments seek to both crush the space of ideas and thinking. They crush spaces of independence, and they do it very carefully and effectively by using the coercive powers of the state to both curb funding. I have had to deal with a lot of this in a hat that I wore previously as the head of a think tank, using powers of taxation, of licenses to access foreign funding to crush spaces. And one of the so in some senses, organizations and leaders are struggling just for survival, and the whole system is designed to keep you in this loop of consistently responding to how the coercive powers of the state are using their levers of paperwork, of demands, tax demands, of requests for information out of licenses to keep you in the courts and keep you far away from actually doing the work that you're meant to do. But it raises very big questions in two forms. One, for domestic philanthropy, we discussed a lot about what domestic African philanthropy, for instance, can do to respond to the big challenges of international aid. But I think one of the problems is that in these moments of democratic backsliding, domestic philanthropy, which comes from domestic capital or local capital, also has to deal with its own political economy, which pushes it away from openly supporting and financing research and mobilizations that are challenging power structures. So how do we find mechanisms for mobilizing resources in ways that don't fall into the trap? What we hear a lot in India: only do technocratic work, keep your head down, don't ask difficult questions, make sure you praise the government first, praise the government at the end, and bury your critiques somewhere somewhere in the middle, which takes away from the purpose and one's own professional ethic for why we collect evidence and speak knowledge and use knowledge as a resource to ask difficult questions of structures of power. So challenging capital itself and challenging the way in which philanthropy is going in these moments, I think, is an important part of our debate, and we should be thinking a lot about strategies around that. But also there is a bigger institutional question. How do institutions survive? Does the act of keeping your head down and acquiescing on something so that you can survive appear as a strategy to be able to mobilize when opportunities come? Or do you actually call out what government is doing and put it into the public domain? Because bullies always seek to bully you by seeking to silence you. Do you acquiesce through silence in the hope to live another day? Or do you push back and really challenge? And we see this in the US too, universities signing deals with the bully effectively. That is happening as a way of surviving. So I think there's a need for a conversation on how do you build out strategies to respond so that civil society itself is not doesn't kind of disappear, but actually in a moment when it has to play a really important role. And the act and art of knowledge creation should hold on to the power of knowledge generation rather than be responding to the power structures and the finances. And that again is a difficult question because we're all used to having money to do research. So what does it mean to ideate without resources is a question for us as a knowledge community to also think about. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And the risks are very, very real. Batuhan.
Yeah, I can also add a couple of points to this question. Firstly, I think the case of US as a donor is very important because yes, today it's not a donor, but it's also started to support the far-right actors more and more in Europe and in other countries as well. So the Heritage Foundation, Trump himself, and Musk became particularly important actors, as I mentioned, that are approached frequently by the far-right actors in Europe, and their support brings legitimacy, sometimes resources and reputation to these actors. So the problem is not only about, at the moment, the absence of resources, but also how these resources are used to strengthen the illiberal side. So we should be, I think, very careful and clear about this issue. And I'm coming from a social movement studies perspective, so my answer would be more about maybe it's time to turn our faces more to grassroots movements and people, and try to find ways to convince them there are alternatives, because I think we can, as a self-criticism, we can say that the left and progressive actors are not very, very successful in creating alternative narratives and stories that resonate with people in these last 15 years, which was full of crises, in different crises, like from COVID to immigration crisis to economic crisis. There were some failure attempts by progressive movements to create new narratives. And I think in these contexts, far right also find a way to easily politicize people by using very, sentimental arguments. So I think now it's time maybe for the left and progressives to invest more to understand what people really feel about all these crises. And it's time to start some, create some alternative narratives. We need to use culturally resonating narratives that make people laugh sometimes, just like the memes, but also convince them that, we are available to solve their problems. So maybe the case of Die Linke in Germany as a good example to how to use social media platforms such as TikTok to, reach a broader audience, or maybe Zohran Mamdani's campaign. I don't know, I hope he will be successful, but it can be a case to be maybe studied a bit more. So investment on new narratives, new stories are crucial at this moment, I think, to deal with this wave of illiberal challenges.
Thanks very much. There are more questions on the how do we do this that were submitted through the Q&A. Shandana, would you like to pick up the key points from Mark, who was posting Mark Brown, who posted in the chat?
So Mark Brown asked, how can a sane USA and Europe and other democratic friends maintain and increase their ability to promote democratic values and practices around the world? And there's a few ways to answer that, but for a long time, this was about money, and that was gone. That's gone. And there was another question in here about whether or not we should see this as an opportunity in the global South, where I'm from, where I do a lot of my work. And I've seen that viewpoint come up very often, is maybe this is a moment of opportunity. But what that drawing away of money has done is it has weakened civil spaces where we used to see a lot of this action happen. But it's also drawn money out of research, where you could have amassed more evidence on what happens with autocratization. So as the countries autocratize, go in that direction, there is less and less money for research and evidence that is actually going to show us what impact that has on people. So it's been a huge there's a huge impact, negative impact of what that means. But aside from the money, Mark's question is really about the soft power that they might have. And that soft power, aside from the money, is eroding because of the practices inside the US and Europe right now, and what is happening with minority groups, immigrant groups in particular, that come from these other countries where Europe and the US might want to have that soft power to be able to promote democratic practice. And the questions being raised there are, why are we listening to you when this is what's happening there? And with the autocratization that we might see in the heart of Europe, or with the US in the way in which Dawn just told us. So there is a need to be able to organize in these countries as well, to be able to take on that rhetoric, to be able to change democratic practice in Europe and in US, and to strengthen that in that inclusive, transformative, redistributive way in which we said that. That's organizing, that's mobilizing, that's cross-identity organizing, so that it's not just people of color talking about issues of immigration and seeing other identities as essentially being opposed to it. So lots of cross-identity mobilizing, and a time of increasing civic spaces in these countries where it also seems to be shrinking. But we're going to ask a lot of these questions, and my sense is that the definition of democracy is going to have to change because of the events of the last 1.5 years. We haven't mentioned Gaza at all, but in having this conversation in the middle of an active genocide means we're going to have to rethink what we think of as democracy, and as actors who promote democracy, and where they promote it and in what form they're promoting it. So my sense is a lot of the measures we use are going to have to change, and a lot of the things we're saying about what these values are going to have to change. But I really like that question because it gives us a moment to reflect on what organizing and mobilizing needs to look like in Europe in this moment as well.
Thanks very much, Shandana. And that's moving us to the question of hope and reimagining democracy. And there are questions in the chat about positive examples of civil society groups who develop new or alternative narratives. We already know a lot comes from the arts communities, from people actually doing the good at community level and helping refugees and migrant communities in everyday lives. So people are prefiguring what inclusion looks like. And there's several of these examples, but they seem disconnected and not at scale, and not communicating enough across many different contexts. So I'm aware of the time, Batuhan, I would like to give you a minute to answer that question as well from your work, and then I'll be wrapping up.
Well, actually, I don't have much answers. This is the unfortunate part. I am still searching, and I hope that my next research will be about these positive works that can resonate. But what I observe is that, especially in the case of Turkey, that I focus these days, is to find some locally resonating figures from the local cultures and histories, and bring them to more universal and inclusive images to present them as maybe not role models but heroes sometimes, can be a kind of successful way to do that. I know some artists, as you said, Marjoke, because I think this is where the connection between creative parts of the civil society and the institutional part can come together to find these stories that can, directly resonate with people that live in that specific context, because this is what we need at the moment. We need to find some examples that bring hope to these people, not from other countries probably, but sometimes also from the own countries that these people know, from their own cultures. So this can be a good step to take. And using these creative tactics and strategies and innovations can be a good start. Maybe in another debate, we can discuss this issue more, because I think it's a great question. And I hope that I can find some answer and publish it so you can read. So I will stop here for now.
Thanks, Batuhan, and thanks everyone for joining this debate. You've clearly tasked us with much homework and new ideas, but definitely reimagining democracy is very much on the research agenda here at IDS and with partners. So we look forward to a future bulletin where we hope to provide more of those answers on the new narratives, the new actions that prefigure new forms of democracy, and hopefully at scale to not just counter backsliding, but to actually overcome backsliding and build democracies back in better shape and that work for everyone. I want to thank all the panelists very much for their time here today and their contributions. I hope everyone will read the IDS bulletin and contributions, and please keep joining us in future events, because there's a lot more to come in the next couple of months. Thanks everyone, and have a nice rest of your day.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.